Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. Under the harsh light of the emergency room on a rainy Tuesday night, December 30th, 2025, as the old year seemed to be slipping away second by second and Genoa City held its breath between what was lost and what could still be saved, Sienna arrived like a storm finally hitting land. She burst through the sliding glass doors, her hair soaked with rain, her coat only half buttoned, her chest rising fast as if she had run not just across town, but across years of secrets, regrets, and unspoken love. The moment her boots hit the cold, clean floor, the air seemed to shift. Nurses looked up with that knowing look that comes from sensing something bad before the charts even said so. The beeping machines and distant calls mixed into a harsh, metallic sound that matched the chaos in Sienna's ears. She demanded to know where he was, where she was, and who could tell her that the call she had gotten 20 minutes ago was wrong, exaggerated, a mistake made in the rush of sirens and flashing lights. Because it couldn't be true. Not after everything they had survived. Not after all the promises whispered in quiet moments when the world had seemed still enough to believe in the future. But as she stood there, soaked and shaking, holding her phone like a lucky charm that had failed her, the smells of antiseptic and ozone told her the truth her heart refused to accept. Tonight wasn't about tomorrow or next year. It was about now, about life hanging by a thread so thin it could snap with a single unanswered question. The receptionist asked her name and she gave it, her voice breaking despite her effort to sound steady. Every word tasted like fear. As her name echoed through the corridor, it triggered a ripple of recognition. Because Sienna wasn't just anyone in Genoa City. She was a woman whose arrival always meant consequences. Her past was tied to the present with scars that never quite faded. And beyond the double doors, doctors were already working hard, compressing chests, calling out vitals. Sienna paced like a trapped animal, memories coming back in sharp flashes. The last fight that ended with slammed doors and words she wished she could take back. The text she never sent. The way his eyes had softened even when his jaw was set in anger. She wondered if fate was punishing her for waiting too long. For believing there would always be another chance. Another apology. Another sunrise to fix things. A nurse approached, her face calm, and explained in a slow, measured tone about the accident, the injuries, how critical it was. The words floated around Sienna without landing until one phrase cut through everything like glass. We're doing everything we can. Everyone knew what that really meant. Sienna's knees nearly gave out as she reached for the edge of a chair, the cold plastic grounding her as she fought the urge to scream, to bargain with anyone listening that she would do better, be better. If only she could see him, touch his hand, remind him he was not alone, that he was loved more fiercely than he allowed himself to believe. The waiting room filled and emptied in strange waves, strangers going through their own private nightmares, but Sienna noticed none of it. Her whole world was reduced to the swing of a single door, and the ticking clock above the nurse's station. Each second felt like a hammer hitting her nerves. When familiar faces began to arrive, drawn by rumors, by concern, by the magnetic pull of tragedy in Genoa City, Sienna barely registered them. Though somewhere in the fog, she felt the weight of old rivalries and fragile alliances pressing in. People who had history with her, with him, with the complicated web that had brought them all here. And she wondered bitterly if any of that would matter if tonight ended as she feared. As the rain outside grew stronger, pounding against the windows like impatient hands, Sienna closed her eyes and replayed the path that had brought her back to Genoa City. She had sworn she was done with this town, with its endless cycles of betrayal and redemption, only to be pulled back by unfinished business and unresolved love. And now here she was again, in the most familiar place of all. A hospital corridor where so many lives had intersected, started, ended, and been forever changed. She felt a strange, aching connection with every soul who had ever stood exactly where she stood, praying to forces they didn't believe in because hope, however fragile, was the only currency left. Minutes stretched into an eternity until a doctor finally emerged, his mask dangling, his eyes tired but focused. He spoke her name with a gravity that made her heart lurch. As he explained the next steps, the uncertainty, the risks, Sienna nodded without really hearing him. All she could think about was the moment she would finally be allowed through those doors, the moment she would see him surrounded by machines and wires, vulnerable in a way he never let himself be. And she promised herself that if she got that chance, she wouldn't waste a single second. She would say everything she had kept hidden for years, even if he never heard it, even if it was just for her. Because she realized in that painful clarity that emergency rooms are famous for. Love isn't about pride or timing or winning. It's about showing up when it matters most. And Sienna had shown up, breathless, terrified, too late, or maybe just in time. As she followed the doctor down the corridor, her wet footsteps echoing like a countdown, the spoilers for what was yet to come in The Young and the Restless felt etched into the very walls, promising that this arrival was only the beginning, that tonight's emergency would send shockwaves through lives already on the edge, exposing truths, forging new bonds, leaving scars that would linger long after the calendar turned. Because in Genoa City, especially on a night like this, no one arrived at the emergency room by accident. And Sienna's entrance, dramatic and desperate, was the spark that would ignite everything still waiting to explode. The hallway felt tighter as Sienna walked behind the doctor, the world seeming to shrink into the sound of her wet shoes squeaking and the distant noise of machines that sounded almost like someone breathing, mechanical and creepy. Every step made her feel the pressure of what she might find pressing hard against her chest, because this wasn't just fear or imagination anymore. It was the real thing waiting behind a door. When the doctor stopped outside the trauma room, putting a hand on the frame as if he needed a moment to gather himself, Sienna suddenly understood that this was the moment everything changed. The version of her who had run into the ER with hope and worry might not make it through what came next. But when the door opened and she saw him, pale under the bright lights, with tubes connected to his arms, a machine making soft sounds with each breath, something inside her stopped. Fear gave way to a deep, painful clarity. He was still there, still fighting, still connected to the world by thin, fragile threads she suddenly believed she could help hold. She moved slowly, almost like she was entering a holy place, her hands shaking as she reached for his. She was surprised by the warmth of his hand, even though everything around them felt cold. She leaned in, her voice barely a whisper, saying words she had practiced in her head 1,000 times but had never said out loud. She apologized, confessed, and promised things that felt crazy and naive, but once she spoke them they felt true. She realized love didn't need promises or certainty. It just needed courage. If he could hear her, if any part of him was awake, she wanted him to know she was here now, that she wasn't running, and that she would face whatever was coming instead of hiding behind silence. Outside the room, unseen but very much real, the effect of her being there was already spreading. Phones buzzed with news, people quietly changed how they thought about everything. Because in Genoa City, tragedy never stayed alone, it was shared, it spread, and it had deep meaning. While Sienna focused on his breathing, others were already thinking about what this situation meant for them, forming stories, checking their alliances, and preparing for consequences that would go far beyond the hospital. Time moved strangely in the ICU, stretching and folding back on itself until Sienna couldn't tell if minutes or hours had passed. It was only when the doctor returned with a tone that showed some hope, stable but still critical, the next day being the most important, that Sienna felt the first crack in the fear that had held her tight. It was a tiny opening where hope could start to grow, weak but strong. She grabbed onto it, refusing to let doubt take away her strength. When she finally walked out into the hallway, pulled by voices she couldn't ignore, she faced people she hadn't expected. Their faces showed real worry or hidden interest, and the tension between old problems and new needs crackled like static. This emergency had brought everyone together again, whether they wanted to or not. Sienna sensed some old bonds might come back, while others might break under the weight of truths that couldn't stay hidden any longer. As dawn started to arrive in Genoa City, the rain settling into a mist that clung to the streets, Sienna went back to his bedside. Exhaustion had taken hold, but her determination had grown stronger. She made a new promise to herself, quieter but more powerful. She wouldn't let this crisis go to waste. She would face the unfinished matters that had haunted her since she came back, even if it meant reopening wounds she had spent years trying to close. Because survival wasn't just about waking up the next day, it was about facing the life that was waiting when you did. As the monitors kept track of his condition and the first light of morning came through the blinds, signaling the end of one time and the start of another, Sienna stayed by his side, ready for whatever came next, whether he recovered or not, whether things healed or fell apart. Nothing in Genoa City would ever be the same again, because this emergency had taken everything to its rawest form, and from that truth, consequences would come. Morning in Genoa City did not arrive gently so much as it crept in like a reluctant witness, pale light slipping through the blinds of the ICU and exposing everything Sienna had managed to keep buried through the long night. And as she sat there, stiff-backed in the plastic chair with a paper cup of untouched coffee cooling between her palms, she felt the weight of dawn not as relief but as a reckoning, because daylight had a way of demanding decisions, of stripping away the protective anonymity of darkness and forcing everyone to confront what came next. And when his fingers twitched for the first time since she had arrived, the smallest involuntary movement that might have meant nothing or everything, Sienna's breath caught so sharply it hurt, hope flaring so bright it was almost cruel, and she leaned forward instinctively, murmuring his name as if it were a lifeline she could throw across the void between them, unaware that just beyond the closed door the hospital was already waking into a new phase of chaos, doctors changing shifts, nurses trading clipped updates, and familiar figures from Genoa City gathering with expressions that ranged from raw fear to guarded anticipation, because news had spread quickly overnight and everyone understood that this wasn't just about an accident, it was about power, secrets and histories colliding at the worst possible moment. When the doctor returned with a team in tow, and began running through assessments in a low, clinical cadence, Sienna forced herself to step back, watching as professionals took over, her heart hammering as they called for responses, shone lights into his eyes, adjusted settings on machines that felt both miraculous and terrifying, and then, almost impossibly, he stirred again, a faint groan escaping his throat that cut through the sterile air like a blade, and Sienna's knees nearly gave out as the doctor exchanged a look with the nurse that was cautious but unmistakably hopeful. Because waking up, even partially, changed everything, shifting odds and timelines and narratives in ways no one could yet predict. Word of his movement traveled fast, igniting reactions throughout the hospital, drawing people closer to the room, some out of genuine concern, others because they understood that consciousness meant questions, and questions meant answers that could upend carefully constructed lies, and Sienna sensed it the moment she stepped back into the hallway, the sudden tightening of conversations, the way eyes flicked toward her with renewed intensity, as though her presence at his bedside had already rewritten assumptions about where loyalties lay. And when she found herself face to face with someone from her past, someone whose smile never quite reached their eyes and whose history with both of them was tangled with rivalry and resentment, the air seemed to crackle, unspoken accusations hanging heavy between them, because everyone knew that if he woke up fully, old wounds would be ripped open and blame would not stay neatly contained. Exhaustion threatened to drag Sienna under, but adrenaline and determination held her upright as she navigated those charged encounters, answering questions she barely heard, deflecting insinuations with clipped politeness, and guarding the fragile bubble around his room as fiercely as if she could physically keep the past from walking through the door. And yet even she knew that was an illusion because Genoa City had never respected boundaries, especially not when blood was in the water. When she was finally allowed back inside, she noticed subtle changes, his breathing less labored, the monitors steadier, and she dared to let herself imagine conversations that might follow, truths she would finally say aloud, confessions she had avoided for fear of their consequences, but those hopeful thoughts were undercut by the realization that his awakening would also mean confronting the night of the accident itself, the unanswered question of how it had happened and whether it truly was an accident at all, because whispers had already begun circulating, fueled by half-remembered arguments, suspicious timing, and too many people with motives to ignore. And Sienna felt a chill run through her despite the warmth of the room as she considered the possibility that survival might not bring peace but rather ignite a war that would consume them all. When his eyes fluttered open again, unfocused but unmistakably aware, Sienna leaned close, tears blurring her vision as she told him she was there, that he wasn't alone, her voice trembling as she tried to keep emotion from overwhelming him. And when his gaze finally settled on her, confusion giving way to recognition, the look that crossed his face was so layered with shock, relief, and unfinished emotion that it stole the breath from her lungs, because in that silent exchange lay years of history, and all the things they had never resolved. And though he couldn't speak yet, the squeeze of his hand around hers was unmistakable, a fragile but undeniable connection that made everything else, politics, grudges, consequences, fade for one impossible moment. Outside, however, the storm was far from over. And as the day wore on, the hospital became a battleground of whispered strategy and shifting alliances, with certain figures pushing for access, others working quietly to delay questions, and still others preparing to strike while vulnerability left defenses down, because in Genoa City survival was only the first act, and what followed was always the fallout. and Sienna found herself standing at the center of it whether she wanted to or not, her role evolving from desperate loved one to reluctant gatekeeper, someone whose choices in the next few hours could determine not only his recovery but the balance of power among people who had underestimated her for far too long. By late afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the windows and cast long shadows across the polished floors, the doctor delivered another update. Still critical but improving, cautiously optimistic. And the words felt like both a blessing and a warning, because optimism in this town had a way of inviting disaster, and Sienna knew that the moment he was strong enough to speak, the fragile calm would shatter, unleashing truths that had been held back by unconsciousness alone. And as she returned once more to his bedside, smoothing her fingers over his, embracing herself for what lay ahead, she understood with chilling clarity that this was not just a recovery story, it was the beginning of a reckoning, one that would force every person connected to them to choose sides, reveal loyalties, and pay a price for past sins. And as the monitors continued their steady vigil and the city beyond the hospital walls carried on, unaware of how close it was to another seismic shift, Sienna sat in that narrow space between hope and dread, fully aware that waking up was only the start, and that the real drama, the kind Genoa City thrived on, was only just beginning.